Millionaire gives everything to help the poor, but when he does this, the world turns against him. What now? He used his fortune to change lives, but in doing so, became the target of relentless attacks. What he does next will shock the world. Johnathan Black sat in the top-floor office of Black Enterprises, his gaze lingering on the skyline of New York City. The city below him buzzed with energy, an intricate web of lives intertwining beneath the shimmering lights. His empire, built on the backs of people who worked tirelessly for a fraction of what he earned, sprawled across the city. He was a man whose name echoed in corporate circles, whose face graced the front pages of magazines, and whose power reached far beyond the steel and glass of his offices. But as he looked out over the horizon, the weight of his wealth, of the luxury surrounding him, felt heavy in his chest. The glass walls of his office were transparent, but they offered no clarity. Instead, they reflected the emptiness that gnawed at him, a hollowness that no amount of money could fill. The people below, struggling in the shadows of his towering buildings, seemed like forgotten ghosts. Their lives, their struggles, their pain. He had seen it, but it never registered. Until now. It had started with a single moment, a brief encounter that had shaken him to the core. A charity event, one that he had attended out of obligation rather than genuine care. He had been introduced to a group of children from the inner city, their faces etched with the kind of hardship that no child should know. One boy, no older than 10, had looked at him with wide eyes, asking him why the rich people didn't help the poor. The question had pierced him like a bullet, and for the first time, he felt a crack in the armor of his indifference. That night, Johnathan couldn't sleep. His mind was consumed with thoughts of that boy's face, of the thousands more like him, invisible to a world that only cared about profit and power. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his mind racing with the possibilities. He could make a difference. He had the means, the power, the influence. But the question lingered, would anyone let him? The morning after his restless night, Johnathan's decision was made. He would do something. He didn't know what yet, but he was going to take a step. He had spent his life building wealth, acquiring power, and yet the most difficult thing he had ever done was to admit to himself that the world needed more than just his money. It needed his heart, his actions, his responsibility. Sitting across from his assistant, Linda, he made the announcement. I want to fund a project. Something big. Something that matters. I need you to research the most pressing social issues in the city. Find me something worth fighting for. Linda raised an eyebrow, her face a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Johnathan had never shown interest in philanthropy. Are you serious, sir? She asked, her tone neutral but skeptical. Dead serious, he replied, his voice firm but betraying a hint of uncertainty. Linda nodded and left the room without another word. But her departure did nothing to quell the anxiety that churned in his stomach. Johnathan wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe resistance from his colleagues, maybe backlash from his business partners. But deep down, he feared the possibility that his efforts might fail, that no matter how much money he poured into these causes, nothing would change. The next few days were a whirlwind. Linda presented him with a list of organizations, but none of them felt right. They all seemed disconnected, just another Band-Aid solution for deeper wounds. That was when he met Sarah Collins. She was different, raw, passionate, and relentless. Sarah had spent her life fighting for the disenfranchised, for those who had no voice, no platform to speak their truth. Her organization, Hope for Tomorrow, was small but fierce. It focused on providing education, healthcare, and housing to the most neglected parts of the city. Johnathan had been impressed by her conviction. She didn't want donations. She wanted change. She wanted someone who could make a real impact, someone who could bring their influence to bear on the problems that plague these communities. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, had seen through him immediately. She had no illusions about his motivations, but she had agreed to meet with him. You want to help, but you don't know how, Sarah said when they sat down for their first conversation. Helping is not just about writing checks. It's about commitment. It's about fighting a system that is designed to keep people in poverty. Johnathan felt a pang in his chest. She wasn't wrong. She was speaking the truth. And that truth hit him harder than any financial loss ever had. What had he been doing all these years? How many lives could he have changed with the power he had? The realization was suffocating. "How do we start?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah leaned forward, her expression unwavering. "We start by acknowledging the problem. We start by being willing to lose everything for what's right." Johnathan Black's life, once so carefully structured and predictable, had started to unravel. The backlash from his philanthropic decision hit harder than he could have imagined. His wealth, his status, the very things that had defined him for so long, were now being used against him. The world had turned its eyes on him, not with admiration, but with suspicion. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was the man who dared to care. As the negative headlines piled up, Johnathan found himself alone in his massive penthouse, staring at the blurred reflection of himself in the window. The city stretched below him like a sprawling battlefield, but instead of power, he felt small. Each voice in the media, each message on social media, each comment from his colleagues stung with a brutal truth. The system that had allowed him to rise was now turning against him. How could he fight something that had been built so deeply into the fabric of society? The anger inside him burned, but it wasn't directed at those who criticized him. It was directed at himself. What had he expected? That the world would thank him for doing something different, something good? He had spent so many years chasing success that he had forgotten one simple truth. You couldn't buy people's hearts. In the silence of his apartment, Johnathan clenched his fists, looking at the headlines one last time. He was being torn apart, yes, but he had already taken the first step. He had no intention of backing down. If anything, this backlash was just a sign that he was on the right path. The fight would be harder than he imagined, but he had made his choice, and he would see it through to the end. The next morning, the first major challenge arrived. His business partner, Lawrence Grayson, called him with a stern voice, one that carried the weight of years of shared deals and silent understandings. "Johnathan, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Lawrence's voice crackled through the phone, filled with both anger and disbelief. "This isn't a charity, it's a business. And you're risking everything we've worked for." Johnathan listened in silence, his mind spinning. He could almost hear the old words of advice echoing in his head. "Don't rock the boat. Keep your hands clean. Focus on profits, not problems." He had lived by those words for so long, they had become his shield. But now, as Lawrence's words burned through him, he realized they had also become his prison. "I'm not doing this for profit," Johnathan finally replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Lawrence spoke, quieter now, but no less intense. "And what happens when you lose everything? When the business crumbles and you've alienated your friends, your partners? Is that worth it?" Jonathan's chest tightened as Lawrence's words sank in. He had thought about the sacrifices, but hearing them laid out so plainly felt like a punch to the gut. Could he really lose everything for the sake of helping others? Was it worth it? The question lingered, but Johnathan knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, and despite the fear gnawing at him, he realized the answer, clear and unwavering. Yes, it was worth it. Johnathan lay awake in the dead of night, the city lights outside casting long shadows across his penthouse. The noise of the world, the constant hum of traffic, the restless energy of New York seemed to fade away, leaving only the oppressive silence of his thoughts. His heart raced, caught between the remnants of his old life and the uncertain path ahead. Sarah had been right to push him, to challenge him to go beyond just writing checks and organizing charity events. But now, as he looked at the world from this new perspective, the weight of his own decision crushed him. He had spent his life in the realm of power and wealth, moving swiftly between meetings, deals, and strategy. Helping the poor, however, wasn't something that could be solved by more money or more plans. It was about systems, people, and emotions, forces that no amount of money could control. The media backlash continued to grow, taking on a life of its own. The narrative surrounding his decision had shifted from curiosity to outright anger. A growing chorus of people, from public figures to ordinary citizens, had taken to social media to demand answers. To many, Johnathan wasn't a hero. He was a villain, an opportunist who was using the poor as a stepping stone for a public redemption story. His motives were questioned at every turn, and the hate-filled posts piled up, each one more venomous than the last. Johnathan's fingers trembled as he read one particularly cutting message. "You're not a savior. You're just another rich man trying to justify his existence." It was hard not to let the words sink in, but what hurt more than the insults was the truth behind them. He had always been driven by the need to prove himself, to show that he was more than just a wealthy businessman. But was this really the way to prove it? Was the cost of change so high? He closed his eyes, feeling his heart constrict. This wasn't about him. It had never been. This was about the people, the ones who were hurting, the ones who needed a lifeline. And yet, even knowing that, the doubts kept coming. The uncertainty that had followed him since the first press release still clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake off. Johnathan sat up, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice thick with the weight of his internal struggle. For the first time, he questioned if he was strong enough to endure the storm he had unleashed. The morning after the sleepless night, Johnathan found himself in the midst of a storm, literally. The rain battered against his windows, the dark clouds outside mirroring the turmoil inside him. He had always thrived in the chaos of business, but this was different. This wasn't a game of negotiation or strategy. This was real. People's lives were at stake. When he arrived at the construction site later that day, he wasn't prepared for what he found. Despite the negativity swirling around him, the workers were already at the site. They were putting up the first walls of what would become a new community center. The sounds of hammers and drills filled the air, cutting through the otherwise oppressive silence. Sarah greeted him, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "I know it's hard," she said, her voice almost a whisper over the noise of the construction. "But they're still here, and so are we." For the first time in days, Johnathan felt a flicker of something other than doubt. There was a power in the simplicity of what he was witnessing. These people, many of them without jobs, without homes, without hope, were here because they believed in something. And maybe, just maybe, he could be part of that belief. The workers were more than just employees. They were people, each with a story of hardship, struggle, and perseverance. And in that moment, Johnathan realized that no matter how high the stakes, no matter how deep the resistance, he wasn't alone. Together, they were fighting for something greater than any one individual. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his doubts lift, even if just for a moment. The world outside still raged, but in this small corner of the city, there was hope. And maybe that was enough. The days that followed were filled with moments of doubt, flashes of hope, and above all, the relentless pressure of the world watching him. Every decision seemed like it carried the weight of an entire movement, and yet the world continued to dismiss him. It was as if, despite his best efforts, no matter how much he gave, the system he was trying to challenge pushed back with tenfold the force. Johnathan sat in the small, modest office they had set up on site, flipping through a stack of documents that seemed to blur together. Every number, every plan, every word felt meaningless. Outside, the workers continued their labor, their faces lined with exhaustion, but driven by something deeper. They believed in this, but Johnathan wasn't so sure anymore. He had already alienated many of his former business associates, and the investors who had once praised him now kept their distance. The whispers of betrayal and failure followed him wherever he went. It wasn't just the media, it was the people closest to him. Lawrence, his business partner, had pulled out of the initiative completely, citing too much risk and too many distractions. His friends, the ones who had watched him rise to the top of the financial world, were now criticizing his every move. Johnathan's phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. "We can't let them win. Not now. Stay focused." But what if staying focused meant losing everything he had ever known? Was he really ready to let go of the life he had built? To face the shame, the ridicule, the fallout? He stared at the walls of the small office, the pictures of families, children, and hopeful faces on the progress posters Sarah had made. Was this what he was truly fighting for? He had to push past the fear, the voices, the doubts, the pressure. They were all distractions, tests to see if he truly believed in what he had started. The truth was he wasn't sure he did. At least, not yet. But somewhere deep down, something in him knew this wasn't about certainty. It was about the fight itself. The next morning, something had shifted within Johnathan. The storm of doubt still raged in the back of his mind, but the fire inside him had reignited. Sarah had been right. Every journey worth taking required sacrifice. Every change worth pursuing came with its struggles. The workers were already at the site when Johnathan arrived. He could feel the difference in the air. The energy had changed, like the first hint of sunlight breaking through a storm. Sarah was there too, overseeing the construction. "You're here early," she said, her eyes scanning his face, as though looking for any sign of weakness. "You okay?" For the first time in a long while, Johnathan smiled, a real smile. "I think I finally understand why we're doing this." He looked around, noticing the workers, the small group of volunteers, the families who had come to offer support. Despite the weight of the world pressing in on him, this was real. This wasn't just an idea. It wasn't just a fight to make headlines. This was something that would make a difference. He had feared the backlash, feared the judgment. But now, standing here among these people, he understood. It wasn't about the opinions of the powerful. It wasn't about the headlines or the billionaires who had once been his peers. It was about the lives that were being changed, the children who would have a better future because of this project. "Let's do this," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. He wasn't sure if it was enough to turn the tide, but it was enough to keep going. Sarah gave a nod, as if acknowledging his silent vow to move forward. The first pieces of the new community center were rising before them, and for the first time, Johnathan felt the possibility of change, not just for others, but for himself. The next step was clear. He would fight for this with every ounce of his being. This was more than just about giving money. It was about giving everything he had, and trusting that it would be enough. The weeks passed in a blur of effort, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Johnathan's resolve had deepened, but so had the pressures. As the construction of the community center slowly progressed, so did the resistance against him. The media hadn't relented, and with every passing day, the whispers grew louder. His wealth, his success, everything he had built was still being used to paint him as a manipulator, a man with ulterior motives. Yet, beneath the harsh headlines and the criticism from his peers, something else was emerging. A deeper connection with the people who had once seemed so far removed from his world. He arrived early one morning. As usual, the skyline of the city still shrouded in mist. But today, something felt different. There was an unspoken sense of anticipation in the air. The workers, who had once looked at him with skepticism, now met his gaze with something else: respect. They saw him now, not as a distant millionaire, but as someone who understood their struggles. He met with Sarah later that day in the small office near the construction site. The walls, once bare and cold, were now adorned with plans, sketches, and photos of the families whose lives would be changed by this project. It was becoming a symbol, something tangible to cling to. But the world outside hadn't stopped its attack. "Lawrence just called," Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "He's backing out. He's going public with it. Says we're sinking too much money into a lost cause." Johnathan's heart sank. Lawrence had been more than just a business partner. He had been a friend, a confidant. To lose him now felt like another betrayal in a world that had already turned its back on him. "Let him go," Johnathan replied, his voice steady but his insides churning. "This is my fight now. It's always been my fight." But even as he said it, the weight of Lawrence's departure pressed heavily on his chest. He had always been able to count on Lawrence, and now he was alone. Later that day, as Johnathan wandered through the construction site, something unexpected happened. One of the workers, a middle-aged man with worn hands and a tired face, approached him hesitantly. His name was Miguel, and he had been working on the site from the beginning. "I just want to say, sir, we're with you," Miguel said, his voice rough but sincere. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has. It's not much, but we got your back." Johnathan stared at the man, the simple words stirring something deep inside him. Miguel didn't know how much that meant. In a world where everyone else was pulling away, this small gesture of support felt like a lifeline. Johnathan nodded, his voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," he whispered, and in that moment, he realized the true meaning of sacrifice. It wasn't about wealth or recognition. It was about the people who saw you for what you truly were and still believed. As the construction site began to take shape, so did Jonathan's resolve. The new community center was no longer just a symbol of his attempt at redemption. It had become a part of him, a living, breathing testament to his commitment. But the price of that commitment was higher than he had anticipated. The pressures from his former partners and investors continued to grow. Even some of his closest family members had started distancing themselves, concerned about the financial implications of his choices. But it was Sarah who, as always, was the one who kept him grounded. "You can't change the world alone," she told him one evening as they stood together on the construction site, watching the sun set over the horizon. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try." Johnathan nodded, her words sinking into him like a quiet prayer. He had tried to do things the easy way for so long, following the rules, making safe investments, staying in his comfortable bubble. But now, in the midst of this storm, he understood. The world wasn't going to change because he played it safe. If he wanted to make a real difference, he would have to risk it all. The next morning, the final blow came. Lawrence made his public statement. The media picked it up, and before long, the story was everywhere. Billionaires, charity, a bust, partners pull out. The headline screamed. And for the first time in weeks, Johnathan felt the weight of it all, the pain of his decisions crashing over him like a tidal wave. But then, as the storm roared in his ears, something else rose within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet strength, the realization that no matter what happened, he wasn't backing down. He stood up, walking past the phone and the headlines, past the doubts and the fears. The world might never understand him. It might never accept his choices. But as long as this community center was rising, he had a purpose. And that was all he needed. As the first rays of the morning sun hit the site, Johnathan made a silent vow. He would fight for this until the very end, no matter what. As the months went by, the world outside continued to challenge Johnathan at every turn. The media storms raged on, and the criticism, once directed solely at his motives, began to target him personally. But despite the relentless attacks, Johnathan found solace in the quiet, steadfast resilience of the people who surrounded him. The community center, once just an idea, was now a concrete reality. Walls rising, foundations solidifying, and the promise of change visible at every corner. Yet, with every step forward, the pressure seemed to mount. More and more people within his circle began to question the wisdom of his actions. The phone calls from his old friends grew fewer, and the meetings with potential investors felt increasingly tense. But through it all, Sarah remained by his side, a steady anchor in the chaos. It was late one evening when Sarah confronted him, her eyes filled with concern. "Johnathan, they're not going to stop. They're attacking you from every angle. I'm scared you're losing yourself in all this. This isn't just about a building. It's about you. Don't let them break you." He looked at her, the weight of her words sinking into his bones. She was right. His drive to help, to make a difference, had blurred the lines. He was losing himself in this fight, consumed by it. He had always been the man who solved problems, the one with answers. But now, he was the one in need of guidance, of clarity. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he confessed, his voice low and heavy. "They've taken everything from me. My reputation, my friendships, my future. I'm not sure I have the strength to keep going." For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. She simply walked over and sat beside him, her presence a quiet balm against the storm. Finally, she spoke softly, but with unwavering conviction. "You don't have to fight this alone, Johnathan. And you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep going." And in that moment, Johnathan realized something profound. This wasn't about him proving his worth to the world. It was about what he was willing to sacrifice for the greater good, for the people who believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. The next day, as Johnathan stood at the construction site, overseeing the final stages of the community center, he saw the faces of the workers, the volunteers, the families. Their expressions were filled with hope, a quiet certainty that something was about to change. And it was then, in the middle of the dust and the noise, that Johnathan felt something shift inside him. He had been fighting so long to prove his worth, to show that he could make a difference. But what if the difference wasn't about him at all? What if it was about the people who had stood by him, the ones who had quietly supported him despite the world's judgment? He had always thought that change came from grand gestures, from monumental acts of defiance. But now, standing here, he saw the truth. Change was in the small, quiet acts of love, of support, of belief. The workers didn't care about his wealth or his business acumen. They cared that he had shown up, that he hadn't walked away, that, despite the harsh criticism and the wreckage of his former life, he had chosen to stay. A young woman, Elena, who had been part of the team from the beginning, approached him with a small child in her arms. "This is my son," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "He's going to grow up in a better world because of this." Tears pricked at the back of Johnathan's eyes as he looked at the child, the future of this community. Elena's words cut through the noise of the world, the accusations, the doubts, and the fear. It was never about him. It was about the future he was helping build. He had been so focused on the negativity, on the weight of his decisions, that he had forgotten the impact of his actions, the lives he was touching, the lives that were being changed. Johnathan took a deep breath, looking out at the site as the workers continued their labor. Despite everything that had been taken from him, despite the battles he had lost, this was a victory. This was the change he had been fighting for all along. As he turned to Sarah, standing a few paces behind him, he smiled a real smile, one that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "We're doing it," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We're really doing it." Sarah returned the smile, her face glowing with pride. "Yes, we are." In that moment, Johnathan understood the depth of what he had learned. Change didn't come from a single heroic act. It came from the collective, from the hands that worked, the hearts that believed, and the sacrifices made in the face of adversity. And, for the first time, Johnathan knew he had made the right choice. Just when it seemed as though Johnathan had reached a place of peace amidst the chaos, the weight of the world returned. The grand opening of the community center was scheduled for the following week, and despite the struggles, despite the people who had turned their backs on him, Johnathan was filled with a sense of anticipation. The project had cost more than he could ever have imagined, emotionally and financially. But for the first time in months, the culmination of his efforts seemed within reach. That's when it happened. Johnathan stood at his office desk, staring at the papers that detailed the final costs of the project. The numbers were staggering, higher than he had expected. His phone rang, and when he answered, it was Sarah. "Johnathan," she said, her voice tight with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to tell you this, but there's been an issue with the funding. The final construction materials haven't been paid for. The company that was supposed to supply them just pulled out." His blood ran cold. "What do you mean pulled out?" he demanded. "I mean, they won't deliver the materials. They're claiming breach of contract. They're citing your lack of funds as their reason." Johnathan slammed his fist onto the desk, knocking over the papers, and for a moment, the room spun. His heart raced as the reality set in. The center, the dream, everything he had worked for, it was all on the verge of collapsing. He could feel his body shaking, his thoughts a jumble of disbelief and panic. But he couldn't afford to lose control, not now. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm, though his voice cracked as he spoke. "What do we do now?" "We need to find a solution, fast," Sarah replied. "There's no way this can go unnoticed. If the press gets wind of this..." "I'll fix it," Johnathan interrupted. "I'll get the money. I'll do whatever it takes. We're not letting this fall apart." He hung up without another word, his hands trembling. But in that moment of panic, a deeper fear took root. Was it too late? Had he pushed too hard? The critics, the investors, the ones who had once been his friends, all of them had been waiting for him to fail. And now, it felt like they were about to be proven right. The days that followed were a blur. Johnathan spent every waking hour trying to salvage the project, but no matter how many calls he made, no matter how many favors he pulled, He couldn't find the solution he so desperately needed. The contractors refused to budge. His money was running out. Late one night, after another string of failed negotiations, he stood alone on the construction site. The moonlight cast a cold, silvery glow on the half-completed building, and for the first time, Johnathan saw it for what it truly was, not just a symbol of hope, but a monument to his failure. His vision was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You've been here all night." He turned to find Sarah standing at the edge of the site, her face drawn with concern but unwavering. "I can't fix this," he whispered, his voice thick with frustration. "It's too late. It's all slipping through my fingers." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes locked on his with a fierce determination. "It's not too late, Johnathan. You've never been one to give up. We can figure this out." But he shook his head. "I've tried everything. I've poured everything into this, and it's still not enough. Maybe this was just a mistake. Maybe I was never supposed to make a difference." Her hand found his, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Sarah didn't speak for a long while. When she finally did, her voice was steady, yet full of raw honesty. "Maybe you were never meant to make a difference alone. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's all of ours. And I promise you, Johnathan, I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." The sincerity in her words cut through his despair like a knife. For a brief moment, Johnathan allowed himself to believe her. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone. As the night wore on, the sense of impending failure didn't feel as suffocating. But there was still a long road ahead, and he didn't know if he could fix everything in time. But one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. He squeezed Sarah's hand, his voice hoarse. "We're not done yet. We're going to finish this." And with that, the first flicker of hope returned. But deep down, Johnathan knew this fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The next few days felt like an endless cycle of failure and frustration. No matter how many times Johnathan reached out, no matter how many investors or contractors he contacted, the center's completion remained out of reach. The weight of responsibility grew heavier with each passing hour. He could hear the whispers behind his back, the snickers of those who had once applauded him, now eagerly awaiting his downfall. The failure felt imminent. It was as if he was carrying the world on his shoulders, the pressure squeezing the air from his lungs. At night, the silence of his empty house was deafening. Every light in the city outside felt like a distant reminder of everything he had lost. The constant ringing of his phone, the texts from concerned staff members, all seemed meaningless now. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to fix it. But every solution felt out of reach. And in the middle of it all, there was Sarah. She was there, always by his side, always ready to support him, to encourage him. But even her patience was starting to wear thin. She saw the toll this was taking on him. She saw the light in his eyes dimming, the man she had admired starting to disappear under the weight of his failures. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with potential donors who had finally walked away, Johnathan collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do anymore," he muttered. "I've tried everything. I've given everything, and it's still not enough." Sarah stood in the doorway, her face a mask of both concern and something deeper, something unspoken. "Johnathan," her voice was soft but firm, "this isn't just about you anymore." He lifted his head, meeting her gaze. There was something different in her eyes, a fire that he hadn't seen before. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice heavy. "You're not the only one who cares about this project," she said, walking toward him slowly. "There are people out there who believe in you, who believe in what you're doing, and they're not going to let you fail." Johnathan stared at her, a wave of disbelief crashing over him. He had heard nothing but negativity for weeks. The idea that people still believed in him seemed almost absurd. "Who?" he asked quietly. "Where are they when I need them?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached in her bag and pulled out a piece of paper. "There's a meeting tomorrow morning," she said. "A group of investors who want to help. They believe in the community center, in what it represents. And they believe in you, Johnathan. You're not alone in this. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in so long. Hope, but it was fragile, like a candle in a storm. "Do you think it will work?" he asked, barely able to believe the words. "I don't know," she said, "but we won't know unless you try." The next morning, Johnathan stood in front of a room full of strangers, each one older and more business-savvy than him. His palms were sweating, his heart racing in his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to persuade, to convince people of his vision. But standing here, facing this group of investors, he felt small. The room was cold, sterile, the air thick with expectation. Each investor sat with a clipboard, their eyes scanning him, sizing him up. Sarah was seated next to him, her hand lightly resting on his knee, offering silent support. The first few minutes felt like an eternity as Johnathan explained the project, his dream, his mission. He spoke with passion, though every word felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He could feel the doubt creeping in, the sense of inadequacy. How could they believe in him? In his failing project? What did he have to offer that they couldn't find in a safer, more profitable venture? But as he finished his pitch, an unexpected voice spoke up. A woman in her early 60s, dressed in a sharp suit, leaned forward. Her eyes were piercing, but there was something about her, something that made Johnathan pause. "I like what you're doing," she said simply, her voice calm, yet commanding. "You're not just building a community center. You're giving people a chance, a real chance." Johnathan blinked in surprise, his mouth going dry. He hadn't expected anyone to agree with him. Not here, not now. But the woman wasn't finished. "I understand the risks, Mr. Gray," she continued. "But I also see something in you. I see a man who isn't afraid to fail. A man who will fight for what he believes in, no matter the cost. And that's the kind of person I want to invest in." The room fell silent. For a moment, Johnathan couldn't speak. His heart hammered in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But he had to ask, to know the truth. "What makes you believe in me? In this project?" The woman smiled, a faint glimmer of warmth in her eyes. "Because you've never given up. And I'm not going to let you start now." A heavy weight seemed to lift from Johnathan's shoulders. It was a simple gesture, a few words, but they were everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, Johnathan felt like he was being seen for who he truly was. Not as a failure, not as a billionaire who had lost his way, but as a man fighting for something bigger than himself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could still make it. As the meeting ended, Johnathan couldn't believe what had just transpired. The woman, whose name was Eleanor Pierce, had pledged a significant portion of the funds needed to complete the center. She wasn't alone. Several other investors, each with their own unique motivations, had joined her, offering a collective sum that was more than enough to secure the project's future. For the first time in weeks, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. But as he walked out of the sterile boardroom, his mind raced. He had the money, yes, but what about the people? Would they truly embrace what he had done? Would they understand the sacrifices he'd made, the choices that had led him to this point? The critics, the doubters. He couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he took a step forward, they would be there, waiting to tear him down. "Are you all right?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Johnathan turned to face her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a breath of relief. I think so," he said, his voice still thick with disbelief. "They're in. The project's not done yet, but we have what we need. It's happening, Sarah. It's really happening." A smile broke across her face, but it was tempered with something more, something deeper. She saw it in his eyes, the fear that was still lingering beneath the surface. "You've done it," she said softly. "But you know it's not just about the money, right?" Johnathan nodded, though the words caught in his throat. "I know. It's about more than that. But I still don't know if I've done enough. If they'll believe in me." The truth was, even with the money secured, Johnathan wasn't sure if he could shake the shadows of doubt that had haunted him for months. The people he had helped, the ones he had fought for, would they see him as a savior, or just another man with a pocket full of promises? Could he ever make them see the sincerity of his intentions? He thought of the families, the faces he'd seen at the rally. He thought of the single mothers, the elderly men and women who had been living in poverty for far too long. Would they understand? Would they appreciate what he was trying to do for them? And deep down, he wondered if he had changed, if the man he was now was the same person who had started this journey so many months ago. Was he still the man who had cared, who had been driven by the need to make a difference? Or had the weight of the world, of expectations, finally worn him down? "You're not alone," Sarah said, reading the uncertainty in his eyes. "You have people who care about you. We're in this together." Her words were a balm to his tortured soul. But even as he nodded, the self-doubt lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. Still, for the first time in a long time, there was a spark of hope, fragile but real. "I don't know if I can be the man they need me to be," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "You're already that man," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You just need to see it for yourself." As the community center neared completion, the challenges didn't stop. In fact, they only intensified. The local media had caught wind of the project's sudden resurgence, and not all of it was positive. The critics, who had once scorned Johnathan, were now calling him a savior, a man of contradictions, a wealthy businessman who had turned into a philanthropist. They questioned his motives, implying that his involvement was a mere publicity stunt to rehabilitate his public image. They criticized the center's location, its design, and even the people who would benefit from it. The pressure was overwhelming. Every new article that came out felt like a knife to his heart. Johnathan had worked so hard to prove that he wasn't just doing this for himself, that his motives were pure. But no matter what he did, it seemed that someone was there to tear him down. The doubts crept back in, the fear that he wasn't enough, that no matter how much he gave, it would never be enough to silence the critics. One evening, as he was sitting in his office, reviewing the final plans for the grand opening, a familiar face walked through the door. Eleanor Pierce. "I need to talk to you, Mr. Gray," she said, her voice sharp. Johnathan stood up, surprised. "Of course, Eleanor. What's on your mind?" She sat across from him, her gaze unwavering. "I've been following the press coverage of the center. I've been hearing the rumors, the accusations. And I'm concerned." Jonathan's stomach churned. He had braced for this moment, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "I know it's tough," he said, his voice tight, "but I'm doing everything I can to make sure this works. For the people, for the community." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression softening. "I believe you, but they're not going to make it easy. There are going to be more people who try to tear you down, more people who question your motives, your choices. And you need to be ready for that." Johnathan swallowed hard. "I know," he whispered. "I don't know if I can handle it." "You have to," Eleanor said firmly, "because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the people who need you to succeed. You've already come this far, Johnathan. But now, it's time to trust in the work you've done. Trust in the people who believe in you." As she spoke, something inside him began to shift. The weight on his chest felt a little lighter. Maybe Eleanor was right. Maybe it wasn't about him at all. It was about the people who depended on him, the ones whose lives could be changed by the success of this center. For the first time, he allowed himself to think that he could be the man they needed him to be. The days leading up to the opening of the community center were a blur of preparation, construction delays, and final touches. But as Johnathan stood outside the nearly completed building, the reality of what he had achieved, despite everything, began to sink in. The center stood as a testament to his resilience, to the months of sacrifices, the countless sleepless nights, and the doubts he had fought so fiercely. But none of that mattered in the face of what was coming. As he walked through the doors one last time before the grand unveiling, he found Sarah waiting for him in the lobby, her face filled with quiet pride. "You did it," she said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. "We did it." Johnathan nodded, though the words felt stuck in his throat. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he could be proud. Yes, the building was beautiful. Yes, the funds had been raised. But all he could think about was the weight of the expectations that still loomed over him. Was this enough? Would the community truly embrace it? Would it make a real difference? As the evening of the grand opening approached, a deep unease settled in his chest. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. What if the critics were right? What if everything he had sacrificed had been in vain? The doubt was suffocating, and no amount of external validation seemed to matter. Sarah must have sensed his unease because she pulled him into a quiet corner, away from the bustling crowd. "Johnathan, listen to me," she said, her voice firm but filled with tenderness. "You've already changed lives. You've already made a difference. She gestured to the bustling lobby behind them. "This is just the beginning." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he looked at her, her faith in him cutting through the fog of his doubts. "I don't know if I can keep going," he confessed, his voice cracking. "The pressure, the criticism, I don't know if I'm strong enough to face it anymore." Sarah's gaze softened, and she took his hands into hers. "You are. You're more than strong enough. And you're not alone. You never have been." At that moment, he knew she was right. He wasn't alone. He had a team. He had the people who had fought alongside him. And most importantly, he had himself. He had already given everything for this dream, and now it was time to trust in what he had built. With one final deep breath, he straightened up, wiped away the tears, and looked towards the doors. The community was waiting. They had come from all walks of life, some with skeptical eyes, some with hope in their hearts. He was ready to face them, no matter what came next. The grand opening of the community center was more than Johnathan could have hoped for. The energy in the air was electric, filled with anticipation and excitement. As the ribbon was cut and the doors opened, the crowd poured in. Families, young people, elderly men and women who had been living in the shadows of the city, now stepping into a place of hope, a place of opportunity. Johnathan stood at the front, watching them, his heart swelling with emotion. This was what it was all for. All the hardships, the doubts, the fear, it had led to this moment. The faces in front of him were not just those of strangers. They were the faces of lives changed, of dreams awakened. As he walked through the center, greeting people, shaking hands, he saw the smiles, the gratitude, the tears of those who had never imagined that a place like this could exist for them. The children running through the halls, the young adults discussing career opportunities, the elderly finding solace in a place where they were seen and heard. It was everything he had hoped for, and more. The media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, and even some of his harshest critics seemed to soften. The project, once seen as an arrogant attempt to buy redemption, was now hailed as a bold and much-needed lifeline for the community. But beyond the accolades and the praise, Jonathan's thoughts remained on something deeper, something more personal. He thought of the night Sarah had first found him, when he had been broken, hopeless, drowning in doubt. He thought of the people who had believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. He thought of Eleanor, whose words had finally pushed him to trust in the work he had done. And most of all, he thought of the moment he had decided to not give up, to not let fear dictate his future. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but it had been the right one. At the end of the day, as the crowd began to thin and the center became quiet, Johnathan found himself alone in the lobby, gazing out of the large windows at the setting sun. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter now. He had done it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been waiting for a chance. The phone in his pocket buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Sarah. "You did it. We did it. I'm so proud of you. I love you." Johnathan smiled softly, his chest filling with gratitude. He wasn't just a man with a dream anymore. He was a man who had changed his world, and the world of so many others. The road had been hard. The journey had been filled with pain, loss, and doubt. But in the end, Johnathan Gray had learned the most profound lesson of all. It was never about the money, the accolades, or the recognition. It was about the people, and in that moment, he knew that no matter what came next, he had fulfilled his true purpose. And that, above all, was worth everything. At the heart of this story lies a simple truth. Real change begins when we dare to challenge the limits of our own fears, when we step out of our comfort zones and fight for something bigger than ourselves. Jonathan's journey reminds us that the most profound impact we can have is on the lives of others, and that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories. Now, ask yourself, what is the one thing holding you back from your own transformation? If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own potential for change, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share this video, because someone out there needs to hear this message today. And if you're ready for more stories that will inspire, challenge, and push you to grow, subscribe to our channel. You have the power to change. Will you take the first step? The world is waiting for you.